Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a seriously wild, true crime ride that ultimately morphs into a pretty chilling modern reality. We're going to trace the bizarre, dramatic evolution of hacktivism over the last decade or so. We'll start with internet trolls taking down corporate giants just for kicks, navigate through a massive federal betrayal, and finally uncover how these rogue digital tactics have completely transformed into state-aligned psychological warfare. It's an absolutely fascinating journey, drawn directly from cutting-edge cybersecurity research and investigative reporting. Okay, let's dive into this. Back in 2011, Sony was hit by an absolutely massive data breach, and a group calling themselves LulzSec proudly claimed responsibility with just a breathtaking level of arrogance. They publicly pointed out that Sony had stored over 1 million customer passwords without any encryption at all, just sitting there in plain text. When reporters actually called the people whose data was leaked, including an 84-year-old woman in Minnesota, it confirmed the sheer scale of the mess. But LulzSec? They didn't express an ounce of regret. Their stance was basically, hey, because the security was so incredibly bad, the victims were practically asking for it. Section 1. The 50 Days of Lulz, the peak of the anti-establishment era. So that Sony attack? It was just one piece of a relentless 50-day spree that made LulzSec the most infamous hacker group on the planet. The sheer velocity and audacity of these back-to-back breaches is honestly staggering. On May 7th, they breached Fox.com, leaking applicant details for the TV show The X Factor. A few weeks later, they hacked the internal hosts of the PBS television network. Why? Well, apparently because PBS aired a WikiLeaks documentary they didn't like. So their revenge was posting a totally fake news story on the PBS website claiming the rapper Tupac was still alive and chilling in New Zealand. By June, they escalated from media companies to Sony, and then straight up to the US government, hitting internal databases at Senate.gov. Finally, on June 26th, they suddenly announced they were disbanding. And on their way out the door, they just dropped a massive data file containing internal stuff from AT&T, AOL, and FBI-affiliated groups. The whole vibe of this era was just completely absurd and chaotic. They weren't trying to hide in the shadows. They were putting on a massive show for their hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers. Driven purely by what they called anarchic lulz and entertainment, they actively taunted their victims. They literally played the Love Boat theme song during their attacks. They openly solicited Bitcoin donations from their fans, racking up over 18 grand at the time. They even hacked an FBI-affiliated group in Atlanta just to pick a fight, boasting that they were donating additional lulz to the government.
Section 2. The ultimate FBI betrayal, from hacktivist to informant.
But, the party couldn't last forever. In July 2011, federal agents quietly showed up at a New York City housing project and arrested Hector Xavier Monsegur. Online, he was known as Sabu, the very ringleader of LulzSec. Faced with the reality of a massive prison sentence and desperate to care for his imprisoned aunt's 2 young children, Sabu flipped. Within less than 24 hours of his arrest, the world's most notorious anti-establishment hacker was completely converted into a federal asset. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the bizarre double life Sabu suddenly started leading. Online, he kept up his hardcore persona, rallying a new anonymous faction called Anti-Sec to attack private security firms, police departments, and, ironically enough, the FBI. But in physical reality, Sabu was literally operating out of an FBI building. He was letting agents look over his shoulder, observe his encrypted chats, and use his hard-earned street cred to attract and gather evidence against his former confidants. And according to the reporting, this wasn't just some passive surveillance operation. Jeremy Hammond, an anonymous hacker who wound up jailed in this exact sting, stated that Sabu presented him with a list of targets, including foreign government sites, and actively encouraged him to break in. Hammond even noted he wasn't totally sure if he was being directed by Sabu or if the FBI was just using Sabu's internet handle themselves.
So this brings up a rather massive question. Did the FBI cross the line? By allegedly using an informant to orchestrate hacks on foreign governments, the lines between a rogue anti-establishment hacker and a state actor became incredibly blurred. It was a sting operation that, in many ways, functioned exactly like a state-sponsored cyber attack.
Section 3. The New Establishment Era. The Transformation of Hacktivism. Let's move to and see how this builds, because that blurring of lines completely foreshadowed a massive shift in the cyber landscape. When researchers map out the history of the internet, they identify 3 distinct eras of hacktivism. First, you have the digital utopia era of the 80s and 90s, driven by early hacker ethics and the ideal of building a free, open internet. Second, the anti-establishment era of the 2010s. This is the lol second anonymous era we just talked about, heavily focused on resisting authority. But today, we are firmly planted in the third phase, the establishment era. And the crucial takeaway here is this. Hacktivism is no longer primarily about fighting the power. More often than not, it's about working for the power. Traditional anti-authority protests are being totally overshadowed by groups that align with nation-states and broader geopolitical agendas. They're operating way more like state-aligned cyber warfare units than the digital pranksters of the past.
Section 4. Modern Cognitive Warfare. Shaping Public Opinion Through Code.
Which brings us to the pretty grim reality of modern operations. Researchers are now calling this cognitive warfare. The primary objective has officially shifted away from just technical destruction and moved right into psychological manipulation. The real goal is to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD as they call it, aiming to completely destabilize public trust in institutions. We're now seeing cyber attacks paired directly with massive disinformation campaigns on platforms like Telegram. And unlike the isolated one-off hacks of the past, these are highly coordinated multi-group network campaigns. Researchers track these under banners like Operation Sweden or Operation France, where multiple groups actually form alliances to impact specific countries. Just look at how the targets themselves have evolved. Back in the LulzSec era, a target like a PBS documentary was chosen simply because the hackers felt insulted, or maybe they just found an easy technical vulnerability for a quick laugh. Today, in the modern era, the targets are things like telecommunications, energy grids, and entire media ecosystems. These victims aren't always chosen because they're technically weak. They're chosen for their symbolic societal weight. The attacks are specifically designed to project an image of state failure and make the everyday public feel fundamentally unsafe.
So the crucial point is that this directly impacts our daily lives. With over 50 countries holding major elections in 2024 alone, these democratic processes became the absolute prime targets for these state-aligned influence operations. This isn't just a technical nuisance anymore. This kind of cognitive warfare directly threatens the foundational trust required for global democracy to even function.
The reports highlight that during the 2024 election cycles, voting systems and political portals in countries including France, Finland, Belgium, Austria, and the UK were all actively targeted. But here's the thing. The objective wasn't necessarily to hack in and alter vote tallies in some database. It was far more insidious. It was about sowing doubt about electoral integrity. By disrupting election-related portals, these state-aligned hacktivists aim to undermine the public's confidence in the actual legitimate outcomes. So we want to leave you with this final, vital question to think about. If hacktivism has evolved from a bunch of internet trolls seeking lulz to coordinated, state-aligned psychological warfare, how do we know who is really pulling the strings behind the next digital breach you see on the news? The label of hacktivist is now a highly contested cover that can totally obscure who is truly benefiting from the chaos. Keep that in mind the next time a major cyber attack makes global headlines. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep learning.